home in Newton, which is not as pretty as this background, which is seasonally appropriate once again, of our lobby in Quincy, Massachusetts, which is just south of Boston. You can see behind me in my background a very old-fashioned turn of the century fire engine, when we used to pull them with people and horses and not with combustion engines. So I always like to have this lovely background on. I will share my screen so we can get to the topics. And again, I'm very happy to have you here, and I look forward to some Q&A and discussion at the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to ask for a verbal. You can see the screen, or there's an issue?
Not yet. It's a black screen for now. Okay. Yeah.
It's black screen.
Still, yeah. Oh, now we have it. And
so do you
it's
have
not
it
in presentation mode? Yeah.
Say it again.
It is not yet in presentation mode, but we see the
Okay.
PowerPoint.
All right. Let's stop share and make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Let's do that. And how's that look?
Perfect.
All right, perfect is a good answer. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Again, thank you. Thank you very much for having me present. I'm going to be focusing on mitigating wildfire risk to homes and communities. I think this is a very, probably quite an expert group in a lot of ways, and try to give you more information about what NFPA actually is doing in this realm. But I will want to frame first what we define as the wildfire disaster problem before we jump into all the things we're doing to try to fix that. So in the United States, really a lot of the problem that we have with wildfire is not so much wildfire, which I'm sure you know, wildfire is necessary in many ecosystems across North America, including Alaska and Hawaii in terms of the United States. But there has been more than a century of written and unwritten policies and procedures that really have suppressed fire and prevented natural fire from doing its job on these landscapes. This really creates a risk of larger fires with more vegetation and poorer health. And again, you know, I'm sure there are people on the line today with a deep knowledge of how that all works. So I'm giving you the very, very broad overview. And of course, once these larger fires that may burn hotter, they can be catastrophic in terms of their effects on plant and animal life. This is just a diagram of 80 years of change in a ponderosa pine forest. And of course, when European settlers got to this continent, they really were not about the same kinds of land management that native populations, indigenous populations were. And in fact, perhaps did not understand, depending on where they were coming from, what these forests needed to be healthy, which is fire. So you can see the overgrowth that's allowed to happen in a ponderosa forest, which of course is a fire adapted ecosystem. When fire will come to this kind of an overgrown landscape, it is going to do a lot more damage and even damage those fire resistant trees and other species. So just to give a sense. The problem is multifaceted. And so it isn't just that issue of fire suppression, it's also where we've been building. And you could take these bullet points in any order that you like, but I really have to emphasize in terms of the wildfire disaster problem, which we talk about being hundreds or thousands of homes being destroyed in a single incident. Risk of life and property basically is what we're seeing more and more of that. And we'll talk about how much worse it's been getting. But we've had at least 50 years to where population and construction in these high risk areas where wildfire is natural, things are getting built out there that just don't take the hazard into account in terms of how we can do fire protection in our structures, in our design. Obviously, there is that buildup of trees and brush due to oversuppression and other reasons. And then we have the impacts of climate change that we are seeing very, very vividly in the last few years that are really starting to exacerbate what would be natural fires into these cycles with all of these new disturbances in the forest, if you will, with all that construction that just adds fuel to the fire, quite literally, and the natural or vegetative fuels that are already there. This is, don't mean for you to read this whole thing in detail, but this is, this is updated frequently, as you can tell. The largest California wildfires, and we figure you're in LA, so let's talk about California. When 4 of your largest fires in history are this year, you have a problem. When another 5 or 6 of them were last year, you have a problem. This is dramatic differences over, as you're looking across time. And it's almost as if we're in a cycle of rolling disasters. We haven't really recovered from things that happened 3, 4, 5 years ago, never mind what happened last year in terms of the impacts. It's also interesting to think about the wildfire disaster problem, not just as a function of the size of the fire, but also what's in the way. When I get to the next slide here, you can see a little bit more vividly, but certainly one of the striking things on this list of the 20 largest in terms of acreage fires is that most of them have happened in the last 10 years, 20 years. We're going all the way back to 1977 at the bottom of the list. So things that happened many, many years ago are being dwarfed by what we're experiencing just in the last few years. Now, again, size doesn't always matter when it comes to wildfire disasters. What we're looking at is a relatively small fire at the top of this list, which is the 20 deadliest California wildfires. 18,804 structures destroyed, 85 deaths in the Camp Fire, yet only a mere 153 and change acres. Griffith Park, which is a oldie but goodie in 1933, the 29 deaths from that fire were attributed to non-firefighters out trying to fight the fire in Griffith Park. But you will tend to see large numbers of deaths associated with large numbers of structures destroyed, not always. And then sometimes what you're seeing with 0 structures involved are firefighters or people trying to execute firefighting on the ground. The data on this, it talks about there are many, many fires where there were 5 or fewer deaths, but these have been, again, dwarfed by recent years for the most part. You may know that this past week was the 30th anniversary of the Oakland Hills fire that for many years stood at the record of numbers of deaths in a single wildfire incident throughout the nation, as well as the largest impact in terms of financial loss. That's been, again, dwarfed in the last few years by many other fires. Just to get a sense again of the financial loss associated with these wildfires, NFPA collects data about what they call large loss fires and explosions, which would be at least $10 million per incident. And wildfires continue to top that list. In 2018, 6 wildfires accounted for $12.35 billion worth of property loss. And this was almost all of the property loss for these kinds of incidents, meaning large loss incidents in the United States that year. We know that structures lost to wildfire is, again, a huge problem. I was not able to get the update from the Forest Service for the last 4 or 5 years of data that they would have on this, but you can see the large red dots, 500 to 2,820 structures destroyed in a single incident. You, of course, today would see more large red dots in Oregon and Washington due to last year's fires. But this did capture the huge amount of structure loss in Gatlinburg and that area of Tennessee that you can see. Another concern, because we know wildfire is natural and it returns where it has been in terms of the ecosystem, is those 0 structures destroyed, but obviously the frequency of fire over about a 17-year period. The little black dots are the 0 structures destroyed in wildfires, but you can see the frequency of fire with these little black dots that look like somebody shook a pepper shaker across this map. And it means that as we continue to look at the impacts of climate change and the impacts of construction into high-risk areas, we will see more red dots if we don't start to solve this problem. So a little bit about how wildland urban fire losses occur. And again, I feel like I'm talking to preaching to the choir a little bit about this. This is a photograph just for illustration. It could be anywhere, but it happens to be San Diego County in the 2003 old fire. One notable thing, and we've actually seen news anchors point this out, standing in front of the green tree with the dead house behind it. The trees are surviving and the structures aren't. And why is that? If this was a wave like a tsunami, everything you would assume would be destroyed. And of course, that's not how this works. How it works is you have fire, you have your severe conditions, fuel, weather, and topography that contribute to fires that once they ignite, will spread rapidly and be usually quite high intensity fires. When they enter areas where there are structures, we would call that an urban fire, meaning the vegetation has given way to structural fuel and you have multiple simultaneous ignitions of homes. Now, the typical firefighting response is to single properties one at a time. So when you have 100 homes exposed to ignition and some of them already starting to ignite and burn, you are immediately overwhelmed fire suppression. There's just too much fire and too few resources. You can't do structure protection on a fire as a firefighter the way in this scenario, the way you would with a house fire where you're just dealing with one or possibly a couple of structures. This means that they cannot be effective. Firefighters cannot put these fires out in every driveway, and they're going to lose these homes. And what you end up with is disaster, with many homes totally destroyed because there really is nobody there, if you will, to put the fires out at each structure, and they will burn completely. So what we've learned is that wildfires are inevitable and necessary in many ecosystems, that during these large fires, these wildland urban fires, hundreds of structures an hour may be ignited. And really, at this point, nobody has quite invented a fire suppression system that can stop these losses once it becomes what we would refer to as an urban conflagration, where structures are burning structures. So what we've tried to do is refocus our efforts at NFPA, focusing on mitigation and prevention before the event that will reduce losses, reduce the potential fire intensity influenced by the vegetation, and reducing the structure's ignitability, which is a big, big push of our programs. What we want to do is stop the transition from a wildland fire to an urban fire. So what we want to do is break this cycle. We know we're going to continue to have large fires that will spread rapidly. But if we can eliminate that urban fire, if we can keep the fire away from the structures or keep the structures in the shape that they don't ignite, we will break the cycle and we can end disasters. If we can stop that transition from the natural or vegetative fuels to the built fuels, the homes, we can significantly reduce the likelihood of a disaster. I just want to give a little bit more data about recent, the picture of all of this, and this is available widely on the National Interagency Fire Center. Esri does a USA current wildfires map that draws on this data. Really year to date, and I picked these numbers up last week, year to date, we're actually below the previous decade average in terms of numbers of fires and even acres of fires, given that we're having an extremely active season or year. It's hardly fair to call it a season anymore. But when you think about what's happened in the last decade, it's been a pretty significant decade for fires, size and numbers. This imagery is, again, a screenshot from the USA Current Wildfires layer from Esri, with the largest dot being the 300,000 acres or more, and this was accessed just last week, or earlier this week, I should say. The sort of pale beige little icons are prescribed fires. So in some regions, fire use is happening throughout the United States. But really in California and the Pacific Northwest, we're seeing very large fires burning right now, or that have been continuing to burn. I don't know where you put on this map with an icon a million-acre fire, which is pretty much close to where the Dixie fire is now, that's been burning for months. The conditions really that are driving this too, we talked about the fire suppression issue, but it's also those conditions on the ground with persistent drought that we've been experiencing, particularly over the last year. This D4 highest level exceptional drought has been part of these maps all year long when we look at the monthly maps that they release from the US Drought Monitor. And as a point of comparison, not that 2020 was such a great year, but the conditions weren't even as bad as they are in 2021. This is the comparison side by side from July of 2020 on the right and July of 2021 on the left. So you can see that you didn't even have this exceptional drought condition happening last year, but you are seeing it this year. So I want to speak a little to NFPA's role as a global nonprofit and how we propose to help end wildfire disasters. Some of you may be very familiar with NFPA, but we are a global nonprofit. We are essentially self-funded, which means we rely on membership and the revenue that we get from codes and standards and training, products and services. We also conduct research and data analysis, provide technical training and certification, but the core of especially what I do at NFPA involves public education, outreach, and advocacy. So you may know us for codes and standards, which are critical in the mix here, including for wildfire, but a lot of what we do is trying to reach the public as well as others that can support the changes that we need to see to make our world safer from fire, electrical, and related hazards. So a little bit of context. I mentioned the term urban conflagration, the idea of whole urban areas burning down. Well, this was exactly what the scenario was in the United States, especially the Eastern United States, when NFPA was born in the late 1800s. I don't have the Great Fire of Chicago picture, but I can bet you it looks really similar to these two, which are Boston in 1872, a year after Chicago, and Baltimore in 1904. The problem in wildfire increasingly looks like this, except maybe with some more trees left standing, where what happens is one ignition will quickly ignite other structures. In terms of response, Baltimore was famous or infamous, if you will, for having many companies respond with mutual aid, only to find that the equipment that they brought did not fit the hydrants and the water supplies on the ground in Baltimore. So no consistency, no standardization of how companies were to respond and be effective. So they were ineffective and watched their city burn. As we evolve, this hazard has evolved. We've pretty much cured the problem of whole cities burning down. And so we feel like we can solve the wildfire problem. If you look at the standard that NFPA published in 1935, that gives you a strong clue that the hazard was really different in 1935. We didn't have suburban and urban development with single family homes in the interface, as we call it today, or the wildfire risk area. We had summer cabins. And if you read this little standard, which is in our library archives now, you find that they talk about the poor construction of typical summer homes and the need to protect them and the need to rake away debris and pine needles and things from the structure that could ignite it and not to use open flame, etc. So some pretty good basic fire protection. But our mission in wildfire has been truly in the modern era since 1985, when this was sort of the year that the entire country experienced what we might think of as WUI fires or a wildfire disaster, with hundreds of homes burning in Florida. It wasn't only seen as a California problem anymore, which is when NFPA partnered with the USDA Forest Service and other federal agencies to start programs that would reach the fire service at the local level and would reach consumers, would reach residents about how they could reduce their risk to their life and property from wildfire. So our role, we're mission oriented. We want to end these fire losses. NFPA is a neutral third party for many organizations to help with. This is why we have the partnership with the Forest Service, a trusted source for the fire service and related industries. Things that we're good at include convening different groups, collaborating, and we have a global reach. So within the United States, we developed a recognition program as a means to reach down to the public, right into sort of residential communities, and develop a voluntary program that is a framework to help neighbors get organized, find direction, and take action to increase the ignition resistance of their homes and communities. And what we're attacking with this program is what I like to call the 98% problem. This isn't addressing what codes and standards typically address, which is new construction. It's addressing what's already been built over 20, 30, 40, 50 years that has been ignoring the hazard and starting to end this problem. So it was born after, many people realized more than 20 years ago that we were up against a lot of attitudes and beliefs that we needed to sort of myth bust to be able to get to people with the information that we had to help them start to reduce the risk. So people believe that wildfire is the enemy. It's been depicted in the media and even by agencies from time to time as a living thing with a mind and a soul, and it's intentionally causing us harm, which we all know in the room, I'm pretty sure that it isn't. People believe that it's the firefighter's job to rescue me. In other words, I shouldn't have to do anything because this is fire, I pay my taxes, etc. And the idea is I should be able to call 911 and have somebody on my doorstep within just a few minutes. People believe that they should not be told by the government what they can do with their property, but the government should aid them after a disaster. Many people feel helpless in the face of wildfire, and that makes them believe there's nothing they can do to reduce their risk. So our vision in developing our Firewise programming is that wildland fires are needed, and they should be able to occur even where people are living without having disasters, and to try to make homes and communities more compatible with the ecosystem that they're built in. This is a picture of a home in New Mexico where you can see that there isn't enough fuel to support the fire reaching the home. The fire sort of burned itself out in the ground surrounding the home. So this home ignition zone concept was born sort of a collaborative effort, but this comes out of the research of Dr. Jack Cohen, retired from the U.S. Forest Service and the Rocky Mountain Research Station labs, that essentially what we all mythologize about fire really isn't helping us much if we think there's nothing we can do. And what he was finding was homes that were built a certain way and that were prepared in a certain way were surviving where others were not. And this has been based on research going back to the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s in California, that if you have home materials and immediate surroundings that are prepared, that will dictate the ignitability of the home. What happens right here at the home level is critical to whether the structure is going to survive, and that there are things that we can do to prevent homes from igniting. And more than that, it's not just getting to the individual property owner to do the things, but working across the community, because as you can see, the little outlines of these home ignition zones are overlapping. And that means that these structures will affect one another when fire comes. If one ignites, you have a good chance of the next one and the next one igniting. And that's why they all need to do the work on their property. So it's educating people about the specifics on their property, but also getting them to work with their neighbors. And this is why Firewise, because we know fires are not going away. We're not trying to do a campaign to get rid of fire, that we know that homes are located on private property, which means it's the homeowner's choice of what to do in most cases about their property. And we have to overcome the idea that there's nothing they can do. It gives them the information to change that situation, and it requires the community to act together over a long period of time. So we created this program in 2002 with support from the U.S. Forest Service, as well as state forestry organizations throughout the country. And it specifically addresses risk on private property. We're not talking about working in state parks or national forests at all. Sorry, it's a little bit of a pause here. So what it calls on is individual responsibility, but also working together with your neighbors. It's completely voluntary, and it's a way to decrease the risk for both the residents and the first responders. And indeed, we have many anecdotal stories about fire departments that said that we were able to protect this community because of the work that was done. Otherwise, it would have been a triage situation where we would have moved on. The benefits to this that people get is that framework for action, the education about wildfire itself, so they can overcome some of those beliefs and myths. People, when they take action, increase their peace of mind. It can build community and citizen pride, and in fact, get access to resources that maybe their neighbors can't because they've become organized and they know where to aim to get support, whether that's in kind or grants. So the participation today, the program is active in 43 states. There are more than 1,900 participating sites across the nation, and the increased growth that we're seeing, particularly in California, but in many areas recently affected by wildfire. I also, this map kind of looks a little bit like that structured damage map that you've seen. Experience does drive this program. The risk profile does drive this program. You don't see a lot of activity in the plain states, not to say they never have wildfire or structures threatened, but it's less common, it's less frequent, and then it's much more difficult to convince people they need to be part of this voluntary program. Excuse me. So with all that, as you can see, Firewise USA is nearly 20 years old in terms of a program. It's continuing to grow. It has some great successes, but all alone, it is not solving the problem, which is why we've looked at a new policy approach to wildfire. So I talked to student groups and classrooms a fair amount, and there's a lot of interest in policy and the context in general. So the context in which our program, all of this is sitting, includes the federal and state land management. As I mentioned, fire suppression has been a very strong element of what the agencies do to try to manage land, although that's changing. And the Healthy Forest Restoration Act of 2003 is meant to start to treat vegetative fuels, forests, and rangelands to start to reduce that buildup of hazardous fuel. This act also includes a weak mandate for localities to develop community wildfire protection plans. This is a bit of a quid pro quo. There's no money involved, but if you are a jurisdiction that is part of developing this plan, presumably the Bureau of Land Management out of the Department of Interior and the Forest Service will do more work in areas that are meaningful strategically to reducing the fuels near your community. There's also, which is about 15 years old, the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. This again is an all hands, all lands approach. So not just federal agencies doing this kind of work, but involving the states and locals and even nonprofit and other types of organizations working on wildfire. The Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, and with the recent updates out of FEMA that FEMA administers, also looks at more interest and understanding of pre-disaster mitigation value of what we can do ahead of wildfires, so you're not simply chasing the problem. But what's really missing? I am a planner, urban planner by training and education, and there's extremely little going on with land use planning around wildfire. It's starting to change, but it's really got a lot of catching up to do in terms of very, very different than what you see perhaps in like flood as a hazard, that it's not taken into account as communities are developed or land is being changed over from different uses. Very, very little outside of California with regards to building codes and ordinances that drive how structures are designed and where they are located. There's almost no incentive or disincentive to limit construction in the most high-risk areas in most parts of the country. There's really inadequate mapping or modeling of the hazard. It is hard to map a hazard that is dependent on the wind and ember transport and even structure-to-structure ignition. However, California has done it. And without knowing where or under what conditions to apply these constraints of regulation, life will go on without recognition of the hazard and will continue to build into these areas where people will say to you after the community has burned down, why didn't you tell us that there was a problem? So in that context too, of the bigger picture for NFPA across all kinds of fire hazards, not just wildfire, but all kinds of hazards, electrical hazards, et cetera, is what we're finding is when we have disasters, whether you're talking about the West Texas explosion, factory fires in Bangladesh, the Oakland warehouse ghost ship fire, there's a cog missing in this fire and life safety ecosystem that we've conceived of. You know, if there's not one of these things, whether it be government responsibility, the use of current codes and their reference standards, if jurisdictions aren't investing in safety, if we don't have a skilled workforce that knows how to make the structures safer from any kind of hazard, if we're not enforcing the codes that we have on hand, if we haven't got preparedness and emergency response, if we have a public that's apathetic or just ignorant of what it is they need to do to be safe, we will fail if any of these pieces are missing. So really what we thought about as we experienced, like everybody else, the last several years of these devastating fires, the loss of life, the incredible amount of property loss, we said, what are we doing wrong here? Well, it wasn't so much what we're doing wrong, it's what we weren't doing. As I mentioned, I went through the whole thing about Firewise, which is our, you know, we have a big cog on the informed public. We are really reaching out to the public, really trying to get homeowners engaged, doing all this great work at the community level in a voluntary way. We also, of course, are supporting our fire services and saying, you know, it's really important to have good preparedness and emergency response. But really these things, there's a lot that cannot be done by the public or the fire department to deal with this enormous problem of wildfire disasters. So the pieces that we're not using is everything else. We're not really holding government responsible for what's going on with the continued development and placement of structures into harm's way. If they're not applying codes and standards or enforcing what they have, that's a big gap. If they're not investing in safety, and that's anywhere from you know, basically making sure you've got paid inspectors to go out and look at these issues. And if you don't have a skilled workforce, so if you have the best designs for a wildfire ignition resistant home, but nobody knows how to build one, you're just missing the boat. So this is why NFPA earlier this year developed Outthink Wildfire and launched this call to action to end the destruction of communities by wildfire by 2050. The idea that we need more than a single voluntary program. We know fires will continue, and we know our fire service, we cannot expect our fire service to try to put every fire out. It just isn't feasible. We've watched it fail over and over again. So these are 5 action policies that I'll get into in a little detail. They include the built environment for existing and new construction. They, of course, do include fuel management on landscapes, public and private. They include making sure that our firefighters who do respond are safe and effective. And of course, it continues to require that we engage the public, and that public policy helps to make sure that people are educated not only about the safety of their homes, but that of themselves and their families in terms of surviving wildfire. So the first is requiring all homes and businesses in these high-risk areas to be more resistant to ignition from wildfire embers and flames. We know a lot about how to do this. We maybe don't know everything about it, including, as I mentioned, this idea of ember transport, the idea of just how do you deal with the structure-to-structure ignition problem? What are some better ways to deal with it? How can we develop guidance for architects, builders, and homeowners? And how can we fund and incentivize retrofitting and risk mitigation? Not every community is equal. And when you're talking about taking 30, 40-year-old homes to try to make them more resistant to wildfire, that could be very expensive and not within the power of folks that are economically disadvantaged to be able to do. The current codes and standards, as well as sound land use practices, need to be used and enforced for new development and rebuilding. This seems like a no-brainer from the NFPA point of view, but it's amazing how few places have these requirements in place. And we have a big push to do this, to make sure that local governments are taking these steps and really committing to this. Basically, the decisions that local officials make today are going to influence the wildfire disaster problem for the next 30 to 80 years, depending on what we're talking about that they're building. So we really have to get to these planners and local leaders. Our fire departments have told us through surveys that NFPA does, the needs assessment survey we do every 5 years. They've told us 5 years ago, they're telling us again this year, that most of them, and I'm talking about municipal departments, local departments, not the federal firefighting agencies, but they're telling us that 90% of those local departments do respond frequently to these kinds of fires, whether they be small brush fires, fires that threaten structures, etc. But only a small percentage of them are completely prepared and trained. They don't have the equipment that they need. They're not necessarily meeting the fitness and health standards they need for this very strenuous job. And not every organization has what it needs for mutual aid agreements. Most of these small departments have told us, not even small, I mean, they're just the local departments have said, if we have more than 20 structures that we have to attend to in a given incident, we can't do it alone. We need help from somebody else. So that really means that they have to have mutual aid. Finally, again, government really needs to increase the resources they have for vegetative fuel management. The Healthy Forest Act has sort of set out the millions of acres that need to be treated annually, and the country is falling behind in this regard. So we need to keep pressing for funding for the treatment of fuel. And in fact, many folks are steering us now to the notion of using prescribed fire in more places than has been traditionally used, as a very effective tool that also is cost effective to start to reduce these fuels. And we need the government to be accountable and track the progress they make in wildfire risk reduction. And finally, as I talked about quite a bit, it's my bread and butter, helping the public understand its role and take action in reducing wildfire risk. And this can be done through policy as well as direct programming. Basically, one of my things is, I believe if you build it, they will come. If you create a desire and a customer need for homes that are more ignition resistant, whether that's retrofit or new build, that skilled workforce will respond. They'll look for training, they'll look for qualifications, they'll look for those opportunities to build better. So that, I just leave you with more information. NFPA has many areas on the website about wildfire, but if you want to start off to look at our propositions around what we think needs to be done to end the wildfire disaster problem, you can start with our wildfire policy pages. We're also on Twitter and Facebook, and our blog content is focused on this issue quite heavily. So I want to say thank you so much for the time, and I look forward to more discussion today.
Thank you, Michelle. This was a great presentation. So I have a few questions of my own, but I will ask the audience to unmute themselves and ask their questions. If they're shy, type it in the chat window and I'll pose them to Michelle.
Go ahead, Lawrence.
So one, I want to thank you for
a real excellent presentation and a look into how you're approaching this, reducing the urban fire risk and exposure. We've run across a couple other programs, one here at the University of Nevada called Living with Fire, which has been going for about 25 years, and a fire adapted communities network. And I'd like to hear how you interact with them, if at all, and you know, your overlap with those programs.
Sure, happy to discuss it. Yeah, so I should say, you know, oh, it says I'm screen sharing. I thought I stopped. I'm sorry. I don't know what you're seeing now.
Picture.
My Dahlia.
Yeah.
Yeah, it cheers me up whenever I turn the computer on. Thank you. So thanks for the question. Yes. So I should say that the notion of you know, educating the public about how to reduce ignitions from wildfire and so forth at your home and community didn't derive independently with NFPA. It kind of all popped up in the late 90s and onward with a variety of forces coming together, including people like Jack Cohen with the Forest Service, other researchers in Canada that were all sort of discovering things from experiments they were doing in the late 90s with radiant heat, and realizing that, you know, one of the big aha moments was, well, we can be burning a whole forest over here, but 30 feet away, we've got a wood wall that's not igniting. Isn't that interesting? So, and looking at the impact of embers and the impact across the community. So it's not original, you know, we invented it, right? So these programs, including the Canadian Fire Smart program, the Living with Fire, there's a few others, we're all kind of emerging around that era. So we know that there's some very tailored programs in different states. What we like to do is look at where we can all support each other. So what Firewise really offers specifically is that very specific tool, because as I said, our basic education is very similar to everybody else's. We're all kind of saying the same thing, maybe with some different graphics or terminology, but that's the focus. And Firewise specifically now refers to the program where people walk through a set of criteria to become recognized. And we don't say certified because, as many of you probably know, that's a very specific thing about professional sort of individual certification, which we do not do. We recognize community effort through a set of criteria that we manage, and we do that in partnership with state forestry. So we know some states that have adopted Firewise as their education program, and they sort of just use the name that way. Living with Fire, there's been a bunch of different projects in Oregon that might go right down to the county level. So they're all really great. And we love to see people basically taking on, when they know their audience and they know, like, our cartoon graphic with the flat ground doesn't work for them. We've heard that a lot. Like, we don't have flat ground anywhere in our community. That's when they should adapt and tailor the messaging to reach their communities, and they do. Fire Adapted Communities and the Learning Network has been a great partner. I think this was coming out, I will say, about 15 years ago, out of various reviews that the Forest Service was doing. And again, Firewise is very specific to built environment and community, you know, action, to say, well, what about the watershed? And what about the next door, you know, what about the community wildfire protection plan, where we engage the, you know, the national forest and the state park and the utility company? And we said, that's fantastic, but that's not, you know, that's beyond our reach with this program. And so go forth and conquer. So they've been a great, the Fire Adapted Communities concept goes beyond the structural ignitability focus, I think, that Firewise has, but it includes it. So we are, you know, informally, you know, collaborating with that, the whole bunch of people that are involved in that.
Okay, that's great to hear. Kind of my perspective is that if this wasn't extremely important, we wouldn't have so many people working on it. So it's great to hear that you're coordinating with them.
Yeah, great.
All right, we have a question from Hamid Ibrahimian. Hamid, go ahead, please.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much again for your very nice presentation. So I want to follow up on what Lawrence asked, and what my understanding is that getting into this grassroots type of problems and helping the local communities really to foster and embrace the program needs much more than developing a program. It really needs a trust and relationship building and get in touch with the people in the communities that can advocate things. And so thinking about expanding your program nationally, what is your strategy on that social aspects of encouraging people to get involved with your program? I mean, embrace your program, learn from it, you know, and all these things. Again, just one more thing, that what we learned from this Living with Fire, I'm also in University of Nevada, Reno, was that they have invested more than 25 years in building the trust and relationship with local communities, so people will actually now listen to them. What's your thought on that part of the program?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because we're, you know, as I mentioned, I'm sitting in an urban area on the East Coast, and people say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Where we've been able to overcome that obvious disparity, you know, that why is an East Coast organization telling us how to do wildfire in California? That doesn't sound right. Is really that relationship with state forestry. And that's true, I think, across the country. When we first piloted the program just prior to my coming to NFPA and starting to get to know these state forestry organizations, many of them said, you know, not California, but many others said, we have been trying to work with property owners on this problem for years, and they don't want to hear from government, but now you've given us something that's, you know, NFPA is neutral, it's not the government, but we can carry the message now to say, you'll get recognized, you'll get kind of, you know, patted on the back for doing these things, you'll get a sign, you'll get a plaque, you'll get your name on a website. And indeed, that has been really the thing, is the recognition. I joked for many years that, you know, we run this program with, you know, $40 signs, you know, it's, and we used to put stickers on we used to have stickers that would go on for each year, but it got a little cumbersome. You know, the $2 stickers were how we ran the program, because people got so engaged in their own stuff. You know, once they got the help from the state to kind of get to the website, maybe do a talk, you know, have somebody come out and do a talk or a walkabout, and then they would just go for it. And then, you know, once they got involved, they got so proud of it that I'd be getting calls at the beginning. We renew the status every year. So it's also, you do the thing, but you don't stop. You continue to renew your status every year by continuing to take action, work on your plan, mitigate your risk year after year. And every January I'd get calls, where's my sticker? Because they got so invested in We Are Firewise that they wanted to show it. And so there is that bit of social psychology that we could implement there. We've changed up a little bit of how we do things, but it's still there. And recognition is extraordinarily important, and more important than even I could ever have believed it would be. It also struck me, my background is in floodplain management and hazard mitigation grants and things like that. And coming to NFPA and having people tell me, for a voluntary program where you're supposed to report once a year on a minimum of things, having people call me, you know, well, we reported in the spring, but we also do an event in the fall. We'd like to report to you more. And I thought, you know, I used to give away FEMA money for big projects where you couldn't get anybody to report to you about anything, and you'd have to go harass them. And they're getting millions of dollars. You know, here's a little community putting in their own sweat equity and using their own labor, and they're wanting to tell me more. So very, very interesting. But that's really, I think it builds on itself. And because we're a very small group within an NFPA that does this work, we are not running around, you know, preaching. You know, it's great to be able to use webinars and other options, and we do that, but we have to rely on our state partners and others to carry the water and carry the message for us.
Let me jump in with a question of my own. Oh, Brian had a question. So Brian, I'll yield the floor to you. Please go ahead, ask your question.
Thanks, ET. Thanks, Michele, for a very interesting presentation. One thing I wanted to ask, kind of building off of the other discussions a bit, is how you engage with the communities around the concept of risk, because you've used risk in a few different contexts, and the lay public often perceives risk differently. And you talked about a bit the lack of modeling. So if we think about predicting the risk of wildland fire and how communities might become more at risk with climate change and what can be done to work with that, what types of mechanisms and strategies have you used in talking about risk with stakeholders to kind of get them on board with understanding the issues and becoming engaged in risk mitigation?
Well, I think there's a couple layers to that, and thank you for the question, Brian. When I mentioned the risk modeling and so forth, I find, and I come again out of floodplain management, using the 100-year flood maps and so forth. They're not awesome, but they're something, and they give you a basis to say this is where the biggest problem is, and this is what we're going to now apply. If you're in this zone, you have to be here. And in order to apply regulation, you need that. In order to convince people to do things, you don't necessarily need that. And I'm curious when we get there, if that will help or hurt the voluntary efforts. I think what I've seen, depicting risk, I think you're going to have to do relative risk. You're going to have to help people understand what they can do to mitigate the risk. And that's a key piece, because especially if it's coming from regulation, people feel like that's onerous. They don't understand that what they are asked to be, asked or being told to do, why, it's important. And the why is so critical. I think that we have to, yeah, I'm just thinking about this. It's been on my mind. I read this article that someone wanted me to comment on out of, it was someone from the BBC asking me to comment, but it was out of Europe. And it was a very interesting terminology about the fires in Europe being exacerbated by abandoned agricultural land. But the researcher, who I've heard before or read before, was quoted as saying, once the fires get like this, they get a soul and an intent. And I thought, are you serious? We can't continue to tell fairy tales about this to the public. We have to tell them science, and it's not that hard. I remember sitting on a back porch with a lady who was very engaged in work in her community, who was contemplating Firewise and in Colorado, and she said that the mitigation specialists from the state had come out and walked the property and talked to her about 30 feet of defensible space. And, and I said, well, do you know why the person told you that? Well, no. So I talked about Jack Cohen's research with the wall and the flames. And she's like yelling at her husband, honey, get in here. You've got to hear about this. I mean, this gets people so excited because they know they're being told the truth, right? Here's some truth. Here's some research. Here's what it means. Here's what you can do. This is, I mean, I know that's not very technical, but that is really critical for people to understand. Not just you've got 100, you've got a 50% chance of your home burning down in this time frame, but here's what you can do is the part that has to be accompanied with that. And that's actually even in, I believe, in California law on real estate disclosures about hazards. You can't just disclose the hazard, you have to say what you can do. So I found that very interesting when I discovered that. It's critical to getting people to act instead of either fight you or put their head in the sand.
Let me just jump in with my couple of questions then. In your opinion, Michele, what are the biggest areas that would require research, and what type of research would that be? Could, for example, engineers play a role, social scientists? What are the biggest sort of knowledge gaps in achieving, I guess, protection against wildfires from your group's perspective?
Right. And we do know a lot, and that's what we need to share with people and be honest about it and clear about the hazard and what they can do, and also personalizing it. So in other words, if I'm speaking to a group in Florida, they may be interested because they saw what happened in California, but they will not relate to fire coming over a mountain. So you have to make that clear. I think that certainly looking at, there's always more work to do with how the fuels react. I think that really in California right now, what I'm hearing from the fire service folks and and folks at CAL FIRE is they're almost feeling like they have to rethink their whole programs or their whole way of doing things, because the situation has changed so much with the impacts of climate change that this is not the fires they were fighting 30 years ago. It's just not. And they know that it's not a fluke. So I think that trying to get into what can we predict about how future fires will behave if these conditions continue, exacerbate, or are mitigated. I also think that, as I mentioned, the issue of wind transport and embers has been largely overlooked in terms of trying to dig into, you know, how that all works, and then how then would you communicate the level of risk. I've seen somebody call it the ember zone. I don't know that you can zone it, but you certainly can talk about ember impacts. And I think that the more credible research we have that then can be put into action is really critical. And there's really, surprisingly to me, very little that's been done on the structure-to-structure ignition from the exteriors. And I sometimes have this conversation with my colleagues who are fire protection engineers. What you end up getting taught in fire protection engineering is a compartmentalization and containing the fire inside of a building, which is, you know, what you're taught. And when you get outside, all that's out the window. I mean, it's completely different. So really, I think there is already work going on in the engineering community, and there needs to be more. And I think looking at a systems approach is also really, really critical, that you can't limit it to what's going to happen right here at this wall when you've got so much dynamic fire happening all around. You know, even when, you know, usually reporters want to pin you down to, well, what specifically caused this home to burn? Well, probably about 5 different things caused that home to burn. But ember penetration is pretty high up on the list, but you could also have surface fire impacting. You could also have radiant heat impacting at the same time. So I think breaking those out for people would be very, very important to helping us solve this issue. I also think there's been little done on design, and not just the home design, but the community design around different issues. In fact, I was reading something and I kind of had a reaction to it because I worry so much about structure to structure ignition, and we've seen it so much, is some material was coming out about how, well, it's easier for firefighters to protect clustered structures because they're close together. And I thought, if, you know, if all other things aren't, you know, bursting into flames around you, sure. But that, I don't know. I don't know from a firefighting point of view and from the structural point of view, what is a better design. And I don't want to poo-poo that statement that has been made, but if we have a big unknown there, that's a good research opportunity.
All right. Lawrence, you have another follow-up question?
Yeah, well, first, it was very interesting to hear you talk about your experience in floods, because this all sounds so much like national flood risk, except for there's no equivalent of the National Flood Insurance Program that puts the federal government on the hook for local zoning and building decisions that the federal government has no control over. So to a certain degree, we're in a better position here. Mm-hmm. You know, I think kind of following on ET's question, we're really interested in hearing what kind of technical capabilities you could use to really change the game. And you talked about a number of these, and I think some of the frameworks we're looking at allow us to really, with potentially high accuracy, do a lot of synthetic fires on the computers, where we can look at different community designs, different fuel loads, the return on investment for different fuel mitigation or building hardening campaigns. Would something like that be useful to you?
I think so. I think that, and I think uncovering, I think also looking into historical fire. Now, I just said that, you know, situations are changing so dramatically with the conditions, but, you know, we're still seeing that, you know, the Tubbs fire that hit Santa Rosa is one great example to where, you know, Coffee Park had been zoned, the subdivision that burned to the ground, you know, from ember impacts in that fire. They had been zoned unburnable by CAL FIRE or by the state, which boggles your mind, but you know, you look at the urbanized area. Well, when you look at the map from the Hanley fire that was almost the same footprint in 1964, that subdivision didn't exist. So it didn't burn because it wasn't there, you know, so it was less flammable in the 64 fire because you didn't have structures there. And then all of a sudden you have this intense amount of structures with lots of ornamental vegetation to burn. So there's this notion that, you know, and I think that, I actually think the message that wildfire will return to these landscapes on a periodic basis, kind of like flood, not quite as easy, but you know, that you will see that. And if you realize that you're built in essentially a burn scar, you know, maybe that will change how you're doing things, both from a regulatory point of view and a voluntary point of view.
Sure. And let me just continue real quick. We test these models out on historical fires like the campfire. So those will be nice places to start because all the models have already been kind of really well looked at to see how they did or how they didn't accurately represent the fire spread, speed.
I think it's an important element. Absolutely.
Yeah. And we can also then easily deal with climate change by turning the dryness up 10% and perhaps the temperature up 15% and see how things change for exactly the same fire. That's kind of the power of some of this approach.
All right, we have time for maybe one more question, and I see Michael from University of Nevada. Michael, go ahead.
Hi, Michelle. Great presentation. I'm sorry I missed the start of it.
That's okay.
I think we actually met in Reno a few years ago.
I wouldn't doubt it. I'm in Reno. I'm in Reno every year that they have a conference in person. So,
yeah, my question is like, so for, I mean, you know, like this summer, for example, there's some really large fires. So like, you know, for example, South Lake Tahoe, which is just a little bit south of here, they knew for about 2 or 3 weeks that there was a risk of fire coming in. So like, while there wasn't a lot of, or maybe there wasn't great defensible space compliance, for example, when the fire started, certainly when it got to town, there was a lot of brush that had been cleared and a lot of work that had been done. I was wondering if your group does anything, like given the size of these fires and the fact that you do have a lead time for a lot of these communities, any kind of rapid response, in addition to like just urban planning, but anything in like, you know, like during the fire to maybe do some home hardening.
yeah, we tend not to. It's not really quite possible for my small staff to monitor, you know, this, but within the states, obviously, that's a great opportunity. If you've got a 2-week lead time, wow, you know, that's amazing. You don't always have that lead time, obviously, but it is really though why we push an approach. Both you have to be doing these things periodically and all the time, or year round, we should say. And we also came out a few years back with a campaign that we've aimed in first Saturday in May, a little bit like Fire Prevention Week, but it's Wildfire Community Preparedness Day. So it is a kind of a call to action for folks to get together and do things on a day, like a community service type approach. But it also gets that consciousness that, you know, May tends to be a pretty good time of year for most folks to get out there and do things. It's not ideal across the country, but the notion that you do need to be doing this work periodically and you don't let up. You can't just, you know, hope this year we won't get any fires, you know, but that, yeah, that's sort of more rapid response. If there's time, those are really good things. And there's plenty of, you know, the general educational information about, you know, rake out that mulch, move that vehicle, move that firewood pile. But the longer term, we've got to get people looking at the vulnerabilities on the structure. You're not going to go install new ember resistant vents, you know, with a 1-week time. Well, maybe you can, but, you know, most folks don't have that kind of time and money and motivation to go do structural hardening, if you will, to structures that, you know, is the other piece that really needs to get done. But thanks for that. Thanks for that comment and question. And it was very heartening to see Tahoe not have the impacts that they'd had several years back. The 2007 Angora fire was really significant in that area.
Thanks, Michelle. Let me ask this one tiny follow-up question based on what you just said. Does NFPA get involved in designing incentives for insurance and protection programs? You're advocating, but do you actually partner with any insurance agency or government agency to design some incentives? Does that ever happen?
It's sort of underway now. So as I mentioned, Firewise was really designed for reasons that had to do with educating the public and getting them to activate. And I don't think anybody who was there 20 years ago thought that this would still be a program in 20 years. You know, it's one of those, let's try this. But it's gotten a huge amount of support and an uptake. And when probably about 10 years ago, I was having conversations with USAA, major insurer in the country that insures military veterans and their families, if you haven't watched their ads. But they were saying, you know, what if we, you know, gave a discount? And I said, well, you'd be the hero, because everybody, literally every homeowner I've ever talked to about this program who, you know, doesn't know anything coming in, and you start telling them about, they say, well, what's it going to do for my insurance? And for many years I said nothing, and you should do it anyway, because at that time we weren't having the same experience, and insurance companies base things on history for the most part. Believe it or not, the California law does not allow them, although that's going to change, I think, to use risk modeling to set rates for reasons that I won't get into here. But obviously when USAA did that, they started in California in 2014. They've now provided that for their members in about 9 other states. And they have analyzed it, basically looking at a snapshot of time and the losses that are experienced by their members who live inside Firewise sites versus those outside them in the same state. And they see a difference. So they're seeing something that's making a difference, and they're putting their money where their mouth is in terms of providing some discounts. It's not huge numbers, just because we don't have that level of penetration across all the states, but they've told us about 32,000 customers of theirs are in Firewise sites across those 10 states. And they still are seeing some positive benefits, even though they have experienced losses. As you would imagine, when Firewise sites self-select, they are high-risk communities almost always. So they are seeing that. So right now, try to wrap up the question, as I know we're running on time here. The Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, which is a insurance trade that's a research and communications group. They've been doing a lot of great research on structural ignitability. The findings are very, very similar to what Firewise and Living with Fire and all those different groups have been saying for years. But they've put even more emphasis on the importance of the home envelope and the 5 feet around the structure from their experiments and their observations. So they're coming out in California within the next year of a home designation, not what Firewise does with a community-wide recognition, but a specific home designation that if you do all the things and we validate this and verify that you've done it, you will get a certificate you can give to your insurer that says that you've done the things, which presumably then would allow consideration to even get insurance in some high-risk areas, or keep the insurance you have, or possibly get a discount if the insurance company decides to do that. So that's the really long answer to say, yes, we are working with partners on incentives. Great.
Well, yeah, we just went over time by 7-8 minutes. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Michelle, I'd like to close by asking you whether we can do a follow-up meeting with a few of us later on. I'd like to try and schedule that. We have, I'm sure, many more burning questions related to the research that we're doing at UCLA, Nevada, Reno, and elsewhere. So
I'd be happy to do that. That'd be fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank
all
you
right.
all.
That concludes our seminar today. Thank you very much. And next week, we are hosting Matthew Wibbenmeyer, who is an economist by training. He's going to also present something very interesting on wildfires. So I hope to see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.